morning. So we started Maseches Shviis. We're in Perek Aleph. We're sort of in Mishnah Aleph and Mishnah Beis put together. The topic of Perek Aleph is Tosfos Shviis, and in particular Tosfos Shviis for a tree field, a stay Elon. And we were in the process of defining at the last year what a stay Elon is. Remember, we said that these Mishnayos that talk about the Tosfos Shviis are what we call the Mishnah Rishona, the first version of the Mishnah of the Psak. The final Psak became the Psak of Rabban Gamliel Beis Dino, like Rabbi Yishmael, that the Tosfos Shviis is Halach LaMoshe Misinai, and that oral transmission to Moshe said that Tosfos Shviis is only when there's a Beis Hamikdash. Nebuch, we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, therefore there's really no Tosfos Shviis, and you can do all work in the field until Mamish Shkia of Erev Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, although we add a separate subject, we'll see, because we have something called Tosfos Shabbos and Tosfos Yontif, that ends up being, for example, Mi'etz Hashem Mashiach should be here, Erev Rosh Hashanah, Tafshin Pei Beis. The next Rosh Hashanah, the siren goes off about 40 minutes before Shkia, and we light candles l'kavod Rosh Hashanah, and at that point we stop doing malacha. By stopping to do malacha, when that Erev Rosh Hashanah is the Erev Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, we're actually adding 40 minutes to Shviis. The 6th year still has 40 minutes left to go until Shkia. We don't do any work because of Erev Rosh Hashanah, Tosfos Yontif. Built into that now, we're not going to go into the field to work for that 40 minutes. So that becomes, according to some poskim, Tosfos Shviis. Even if there is a Tosfos Shviis Bisman Hazeh, you have those extra 40 minutes or whatever time you stop doing work at Rosh Hashanah. At any rate, Tosfos Shviis, Lafi, the Pasha Psak, there is no Tosfos Shviis Bisman Hazeh because we pass like Rabbi Yishmael. But these Mishnayos are dealing with Tosfos Shviis, and B'mher B'yameinu, Mamish, today B'ratzon Hashem, Mashiach will come, the Beis Hamikdash will be built, and we'll have a Tosfos Shviis, which means we need to know the halachas of Tosfos Shviis for this year, for the 6th year. With that in mind, we're now entering into the sugya of Tosfos Shviis. The first Mishnah said that you can only plow a tree field until Shavuos, according to Beis Hillel. After Shavuos, you cannot plow a field tree. Beis Shammai says you can plow so long as the plowing is good for the fruits of the 6th year. Again, now let's put aside Beis Shammai and let's just focus on Beis Hillel. When the Beis Hamikdash stood, there was a din Tosfos Shviis on a tree field. That meant that once a field became defined as a tree field, you can only plow that field until Shavuos of the 6th year. After that, you couldn't plow the field anymore. What's the cheshbon there? Okay, so the cheshbon there is that until Shavuos, the ground is still moist from all the rains of the winter. And therefore, in those days, farmers would plow a tree field, so they would keep on turning over the ground in a way that any moisture that was in the ground from all the rains that had accumulated during the winter months would go deeper and deeper. They would seep deeper and deeper into the ground, into the roots of the tree. After Shavuos, that's the Beis Hillel deadline. After Shavuos, the ground is drying up. There's no moisture now to plow the field so that it would seep into the roots as the ground is drying up. Therefore, if you're plowing after Shavuos, there can only be one reason, because you want to soften up the soil so that the soil will be ready to plant in Shemitah, which you're not allowed to do. So it's nireh, that's the lashon of many Rishonim. It appears like you are now preparing to work your field in Shviis. And this is going to be a big subject in Masechta Shviis as we go through the Masechta. Nireh, you cannot do things in your field that allow other people to think that you're working your field in Shemitah or you're preparing your field for Shemitah. And we'll see why there's a nireh. It appears that you're doing something became very important to Chazal in the halacha. So up until Shavuos, there's enough moisture in the ground for a person to be able to plow a tree field so that the moisture will seep to the roots. After Shavuos, the ground is drying up and there's no reason to plow the field for the fruits that are on the tree of the 6th year. There must be you're plowing the field now for preparation of the 7th year, and therefore it looks like you're preparing your field to seed in the 7th year, therefore you can't do it. So Beis Hillel has a strict deadline. Tree field, you can plow in the 6th year until Shavuos. After Shavuos, you cannot plow that field. Okay, and again, this is not the halacha, because we paskin like Rabbi Yishmael that Tosfos Shviis is only when the Beis Hamikdash stood. And when the Beis Hamikdash stood, the halacha was like Beis Hillel, that you plow the field until Shavuos. We went on Mishnah Beis. Eizehu stay ha'ilan. What is considered a field tree? How does halacha define a tree field? So Mishnah says on page 390 of the Mishnah Behira, Shlosha ilanos lebeit sa'ah. If there are 3 trees growing in an area of amos, means 2,500 square amos. And we read last week, courtesy of the Art Scroll, it's somewhere between 6,200, 6,200 and 9,675 square feet, or 576, or between 576 and 899 square meters. So if you have 3 trees planted in that base, it is now considered, a field of trees, a tree field. What happens if there's 4? What happens if there's 8? Please be patient. The Mishnah is going to deal with everything later in the parak. But for right now, we're defining minimum 3 trees in a beit sa'ah. Im ru'uyim lasos kika devela shel shisha mona bi'italgi. If those 3 trees, now we're going to learn, there are 2 ways to learn the Mishnah. The Mishnah is now giving us a measurement of how much in weight these trees, we're imagining now that these trees are kikar, fig trees, and they used to take figs and press them into sort of cakes of figs. If these 3 trees, now there are 2 ways to read the Mishnah. One is the 3 trees together make the Shishim Mana Bi'italki. It's an Italian coin that had a certain weight. Why did they pick an Italian coin in the Mishnah? So the Mefarshim tell us that this coin was extant during the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. And they used this coin, the weight of this coin, to measure different things. And when the Mishnah was written, this coin was still extant. So they continued to use this Mishnah as a weight. We're going to call it a pound. There are 2 ways now to read the Mishnah. You have to have 3 trees in a field that's 2,500 square amos, or a beit sa'ah. 3 trees in a beit sa'ah. One way to read the Mishnah is every single tree has to be able to give off a pound of fig cake. So that's 3 pounds of fig cakes. And each tree must be able to give off its own pound. If one gives off a pound and the other two don't give off a pound, or if two give off a pound and one doesn't give off a pound, it is not a tree field. Each tree must, independent of the other trees, each of them give off this pound, this shishim mana bi'italiki. That's one way to read the Mishnah. The other way to read the Mishnah is all 3 of the trees together give off this 1 pound. 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. If each tree can give off 1/3 of a pound, 1/3 of this shishim mana bi'italki, then it is a tree field. If one of them cannot produce 1/3 of the pound, it is not a tree field. So there are 2 ways to read the Mishnah. Either this measurement means each tree has to give off the pound, or the Mishnah means all 3 together need to give off a pound, each one at least 1/3. For simplicity, we're going to learn the Mishnah like the first pshat. Each tree must give off its own pound. So now we have the definition of a tree field. 3 trees in a Beit Sa'ah, and each tree grows enough figs that you can pick the figs and crush it into a fig cake of a pound. So you have 3 pounds, 3 cakes, 3 pounds. Then, once I now have that, 3 trees in a Beit Sa'ah, and each tree gives off 1 pound of the fig cake, I now have a tree field. What does that mean, Rabbi Isai? If I have a tree field, that means I can plow the field until Shavuos. Okay. Now let's stop here for the moment. Let's not go into the second understanding of the Mishnah. It becomes a lot more complicated to read the Mishnah. So let's just learn the Mishnah according to the first pshat, because if we're going to learn the Mishnah according to both pshatim, then every single line almost that we read for the next couple of days, we're going to have to say, according to the first pshat, the Mishnah means this, according to the second pshat, the Mishnah means this, and it's going to get very confusing. So we're going to learn the Mishnah according to the first pshat. Every tree must give off its own pound. Now let's stop here for a moment. We're talking about a tree field. We now need to jump for a moment to Perek Beis, page 398 in your Mishnah Behira. We talked in Perek Aleph about a tree field, and then we said there's another kind of field in Halacha, a field that grows grain or beans. So on page 398, Perek Beis Mishnah Aleph, the Mishnah has the same question about a grain field. It's called Stei Halava. The Mishnah begins Perek Beis the same way it began Perek Aleph. Ad Amosai Chorshin B'Stei Halavan Erev Shviis. Until when can you plow a grain field in the 6th year? Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph asked the question, until when can you plow a tree field in the 6th year? Mishnah Aleph, Perek Beis asks, till when can you plow a grain field in the 6th year? So let's now go to page 399. Amar Rebbe Shimon, Nasata Teres Kol Echad B'Echad B'Yodai. Let's leave that aside. Ela B'Stei Halavan Ad HaPesach, a grain bean field can be plowed in the 6th year till Pesach, Uv'Stei Ha'Ilan Ad HaAtzeres, and a tree field until Shavuos. And that's, now let's go back to Perek Aleph. In the time that the Beis Hamikdash stood, Sheibana B'Meher V'Yameinu, there were 2 periods of time of Tais V'Shviis. A grain field you were allowed to plow until Pesach, and after Pesach you couldn't plow it, because after Pesach a grain field plowing means you're getting it ready for the 7th year. That's the rule for a grain field. Tos v'shvius in the 6th year is till plowing until Pesach. No plowing a grain field after Pesach. A tree field, you can plow Erev Shvius until Shavuos. So you can plow a tree field 7 weeks longer than you can plow a grain field. Grain field ends plowing Pesach, and you have 7 more weeks on a tree field to Shavuos. Okay, that's what we need to know to continue the mission. All right. Let's take a picture. Let's take a look at the picture on page 390. It's showing you a field that's 50 amos by 50 amos. That's a base sa'ah. It's showing you 3 trees. Doesn't make a difference if the trees are right next to each other, the trees are far away from each other. The only thing you need to know about the trees is that the trees should be 4 amos separate from each other. We'll see that later in the Mishnah. But for now, it doesn't make a difference if the 3 trees are next to each other or far away from each other, as long as the 3 trees are within the base sa'ah. So at the bottom of the picture, it says, Muta lachrosh eskol hasada l'tzorach ilanos. You're allowed to plow the entire field for the sake of those 3 trees. So if you take a look in the picture, you have 3 trees in the middle and a huge amount of open area around the trees. Nevertheless, you can plow this entire field for the benefit of these 3 trees that are close together in the middle. That's the halacha. You can plow this whole field until Shavuos. I have 3 trees, each tree, and I have 3 trees in a beit sa'ah. Each tree is giving off a pound of fig cake, and therefore this whole beit sa'ah has the rule of a tree field. And what's the halacha of a tree field? You can plow it the whole thing till Shavuos. And after Shavuos, you can't plow it. Okay. What happens now? The Mishnah says on page 390, the last word on page 390. And by the way, if you look at the picture on page 390, there's an arrow that points to the left-hand side, and it says, as we mentioned, the first shot in the Mishnah, Kol ilan roi lasos kika devela. Each tree has to be able to give off that kikar devela, what we call the pound of fig cake. Each tree, that's the simple way to learn the Mishnah. Okay, that's case 1. 3 trees, base sa'ah, each one's giving off a pound of fig cake. The halacha status of this field is a tree field, and that whole field, the whole beit sa'ah, can be plowed until Shavuos. Pachos mikan, page 391, if you have less than this, in other words, each tree cannot give off the 1 pound of fig cake, Ein charshin lahen ela maloi ha'oira. You're not allowed to plow anything more than the size of the oreh. The oreh is the name of the person that picks figs. A person that picks grapes is called a botzer. In Hebrew, people that pick different kinds of fruits got different names. The person that picks figs is called an oreh. If each tree can't give off the pound of fig cake, now what do you have? You don't have a field, you don't have a tree field. If one of those 3 trees can't give off the pound of fig cake, that base sa'ah is not a field tree. And we'll soon see what that means. Therefore, you're only allowed to plow malo ha'oreh, the size of the fig picker, v'saloi chutzaloi, and the basket that he has behind him. So if you look at the picture, picture 6, it's showing you a fig tree, and you can pick. If you take a look at picture 6, right underneath the picture, it says mutalach mitachas la'ilam. You're allowed to plow right underneath the trees. In other words, the branches stick out 5 feet, 6 feet. You can plow that 5 or 6 feet. And you can go outside the branches for the place that it takes the Oret to pick the figs, which is an amma, standing space. And then his basket is another amma. So if the branches stick out, 5 feet, well, let's use ammas. The branches stick out 5 ammas, then you can plow the circle around the tree 7 amos. 5 underneath the branches, 1 amma for the picker, and 1 amma for his basket. So 5 ammas for the branches, an amma for the picker, and an amma for the basket. So now you can plow 7 amos. What does that mean? Let's go now to picture number 5 on page 391. This is where we're going to need the 2 different rules, the field tree and the grain tree. Picture number 2 on page 390, the one we already looked at, was a Beit Sa'ah, 3 trees. Each tree gave off a pound of fig cake. Halachic status, field tree, tree field. And therefore, you can plow the entire Beit Sa'ah till Shavuos. Now let's go to picture 5. You have 3 trees in the Beit Sa'ah, same thing, except 1 tree cannot produce the 1 pound of fig cake. So I don't have a tree field. What else do I have then? What are the 2 possibilities in halacha? I have a tree field or I have a grain field. Once a field is not considered a tree field, it goes to the default setting of a grain field. So picture number 5 may have 3 trees in it, but for halacha, it is now a grain field because one of those trees is not giving off the pound of fig cake. So I'm looking now at a field tree, at a grain tree. What did we just learn a few moments ago? How long can you plow a grain field in the 6th year? Not until Shavuos. You can only plow a grain field until Pesach. Therefore, picture number 5, that Beit Sa'ah can only be plowed until Pesach. Between Pesach and Shavuos, you can only plow, those are the last words on page 391 in Mishnah Beis. Between Pesach and Shavuos, you can only plow the 7 amos under the tree, where the branches stick out. In our example of 5 amos, the amma for the picker and the amma for the basket. So again, picture number 2 on page 390. 3 trees, Beit Sa'ah, each one produces a pound of fig cake. Halachic status, tree field. What is the halachic status of a tree field? Plow it until the whole Beit Sa'ah, all the way until Shavuos. Picture number 5 on page 391. I also have 3 trees, and it's also in a Beit Sa'ah, but one of the trees cannot produce. It's not big enough, it's not healthy enough, it cannot produce 1 pound of fig cake. I don't have a tree field. What else can it be? It becomes the halachic status of a grain field. How long can I plow a grain field in the 6th year? Only until Pesach. And what do I do between Pesach and Shavuos for these trees? I can now only plow around the tree where the branches stick out, the amma for the picker and the amma for the basket. So whereas in picture number 2, I was able to plow the entire field until Shavuos, in picture number 5, I can plow the entire field only till Pesach. And between Pesach and Shavuos, I have the limited plowing area of under the branches, amma for the picker and amma for the basket. So let's read that again, the last word on page 390. Pachos mikan. If you have less than this, each tree cannot produce the minimum of 1 pound of fig cake. Ein chorshin lahem. You cannot plow the field between Pesach and Shavuos. Ela maloi ha'oreh. Only the size of the picker, which is 1 amma. V'saloi chutzalo, and his basket that's outside him, behind him for our purposes. And plus you get the area of the branches. That you can do until Shavuos. And then you can't do any plowing after Shavuos. So a tree field, the plowing can continue till Shavuos. A grain field, the plowing goes until Pesach. And if it's a tree field that doesn't, it's a field that has trees, but it cannot maintain the halachic status of a tree field because it's not producing enough fig cake, then it reverts into a grain field, plowed till Pesach. From Pesach till Shavuos, only this limited area around the tree, the size of the picker and the size of the basket. Let's take now a look at page 391 at the Rav, Rabbeinu Ovadia Mibar Tanura, at the top on the right side of the page. Kimlo ore vesalo. If each tree cannot produce 1 pound of fig cake, one of them can't do it, then you only get the branches, the picker, and the basket. Hamalake ta'enim, someone that picks figs, karui ore. That's his name. We call him an ore. If you were to put a wanted ad in the newspapers in those times, you would write seeking ore. And people would know you're looking for a fig picker and not a grape picker. These were different professions because they required different knowledge about how to pick figs without ruining them versus how to pick figs or dates without ruining them. So he's called an ore. Kamo goder bitmorim. If you're looking for someone to pick dates, you call him a goder. Ubotzer ba'anovim. If you're looking for someone that wants to pick grapes, you called him a botzer. Vesalo. Besides the amma you get for the size of the picker, you get the basket size. Hasal shenosim ba mashu loke. The basket in which he's going to put in that which he picks. Okay, that you can do when ushar hasodeh choshev svei halavon ve'ein chorshin oisoi ella ad hapesach. That's what we're talking about. If one of the 3 trees can produce 1 pound of fig cake, then you don't have a tree field. You have a grain field called a stei halavan. And that you can only plow the whole Beit Sa'ah until Pesach. Done. And then between Pesach and Shavuos, you can only do this limited shear of the underneath the branches, the picker an amma, and his basket an amma. And again, the oval, we'll review that one more time. Picture number 2, 3 trees, Beit Sa'ah. Each of them is producing the minimum of 1 pound of fig cake for each tree. And that has the status of a tree field. Once it has the status of a tree field, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, you are allowed to plow it until Shavuos, the whole Beit Sa'ah. After Shavuos, no plowing. Picture number 5 on page 391. You still have 3 trees, and it's still in the Beit Sa'ah, but one of the trees, for whatever reason, cannot produce 1 pound of the fig cake. You do not have a halachic tree field. You now have a halachic grain field. Grain field, we read the Mishnah in Perek Beis, can only be plowed, on the whole Beit Sa'ah can only be plowed until Pesach. After Pesach, you can only plow this limited shear of underneath the branches, an amma for the picker and an amma for the basket, and that can be done only from Pesach to Shavuos. Shavuos, the plowing ends. So in all cases, a tree field, a grain field, if it's a pure grain field, plowing ends Pesach. A pure tree field, plowing ends Shavuos. A tree field where it's not producing the necessary pound per tree, then you can plow the whole field till Pesach. and only the limited shear under the tree, the size of the picker and the size of the basket between Pesach and Shavuos. Shavuos, again, plowing gets cut off. That's Mishnah Beis. Mishnah Gimel. We've been talking about a fig tree, but there is pomegranate trees, there are apple trees, there are date trees, there's grapes. How do you measure whether you're dealing with a field tree or not a field tree if it's not figs? So the Mishnah says, Echad Ilan Srak. An Ilan Srak is a tree that doesn't produce any fruit. It's not because it's sick or anything. They're just beautiful trees out there that people put in their gardens. They are not fruit trees. Those trees also cannot be worked during Shemitah. Ve'echad ilan meichel, or it's a fruit tree. Rowan osam ki'ilu hein te'enen. We talked about the visual imagery. You close your eyes, you look at your apple tree, and you say to yourself, given the size of the trunk of this apple tree, and given the size of the branches, the leaves, given that, if this tree at this size were a fig tree, would each of these three trees produce a pound of fig cake? You're always imagining the fig tree. So you have a pomegranate tree. The trunk is this size, the branches are this size, the leaves are this size. Now, if this was figs growing on this tree, can a tree this size produce a pound of figs? A pound of fig cake. If it can, and you have three of them, you have three pomegranate trees in a Beit Sa'ah, and each one of those trees, when you close your eyes, you can imagine that it can produce a pound of fig cake, then you got a tree field. It's always imagining the tree, can it give off a pound of fig cake? We imagine them as if they are fig trees. If each tree can give off that 60 mana of the Italian coin, what we call a pound, then whether it's a pomegranate tree, a date tree, an apple tree, because hypothetically it could have given off a pound of fig cake, it has the status of a tree field. And now, what is the status of a tree field? Plow that whole pomegranate area, the whole Beit Sa'ah, until Shavuos. Pachos mikan. You look at each of the pomegranate trees, and one of them cannot hypothetically produce a pound of fig cake. You don't have a tree field. What do you have? A grain field. What can you do in a grain field? You can plow the whole Beit Sa'ah until Pesach, and from Pesach till Shavuos, you can only plow under those three pomegranate trees as far as the branches stick out, 1 amma for the picker and 1 amma for his basket. And that's called sarkum, the need. Pachos mikan. If it cannot produce this, it produces less, one of the trees can hypothetically produce the pound of fig cake, ein charshin lahem, then you cannot plow for them, el litzarkon, only the minimum need, which we already learned in the last Mishnah. The word sarkon means the branches, how far they stick out, an amma for the picker, an amma for the basket. So if you take a look at picture 7 as an example, you have 3 trees. It's in a Beit Sa'ah, and you imagine these trees being fig trees. If the 3 pomegranate trees in picture 7 hypothetically can produce each of them can produce a pound of fig cake, you have the halachic status of a tree field. You can plow the whole area until Shavuos. What happens if one of them can't produce hypothetically the pound of figs? You revert back to a grain field. You can only plow the whole area until Pesach. And between Pesach and Shavuos, you can only plow the minimum area around the pomegranate trees, the branches, the picker, and the basket. And now the Mishnah Dalet tells us this clearly. Hoya echad ose kikar devela ushnayim ein osim. If one of the trees can make the pound of fig cake, and two of them are unable to produce each a pound of fig cake, oshnayim osim, or two can produce a pound of fig cake, ve'echad eina osim, but one of them can't. So of the three trees, one produces the pound and two can't. Or two produce a pound and one can't. Ein chorshin lahem el litzarka. Litzarka means their need. What does the need mean? The branches, litzarka means the minimum need for the tree. What's the minimum need for the tree? The branch spread, the picker, and the basket. So even if you have 3 date trees, let's use the simple case, 3 fig trees, and 3 fig trees, one of the 3 trees is producing 12 pounds, and the other 2 trees can't produce a pound. So you don't say, well, the 12-pound tree is making it up for the other 2. After all, the minimum shear is each one needs to give off a pound of fig cake. Okay, so that means 3 trees in the base, each one minimally must give off 1 pound. So I need 3 pounds of fig cake. Oh, but what happens if 2 of them can't give off a pound and one of them is giving off 12 pounds? So it should be a field tree. It should be a tree field. After all, instead of the minimum of each one giving off 1, which totals 3, I now have one that's giving off 12. So it should have the status of a tree field. That's not the way we paskin. Each one must give off a pound of fig cake. So the Mishnah says if 1 is giving off the pound and 2 are not, or 2 are giving off the pound and 1 is not, ein charshin lahem el litzarkan. It has the status of a grain field, not a tree field, and you can plow the whole Beit Sa'ah until Pesach. And from Pesach till Shavuos, you can only do the tzarkan, the basic need, the branches, underneath the branches, the amma for the picker, and the amma for the basket. Ad shegiyu mishlosha vatisha. This halacha that we just learned is a halacha when a Beit Sa'ah has 3 trees. If it doesn't have 3 trees, only has 2, we don't even begin the conversation. It can't. It's not a tree field. It has to start the conversation of a tree field. It has to have at least 3. From there, we go to the next conversation. Is each tree able to give off a pound of fig cake? If there are only 2 trees there, the conversation of Beit Sa'ah doesn't even begin. So from through the Mishnah says, Ad sheyu mishlosha vatisha. The rule that I just taught you means, includes a field that's a Beit Sa'ah in size, 2,500 square amos, anywhere between 3 and 9 trees. Belineda will see tomorrow what that means. We now know that whatever we learned about 3 trees in a Beit Sa'ah is going to be true for up to 9 trees in a Beit Sa'ah. Less than 3 trees, 2 trees in a Beit Sa'ah, the conversation doesn't even begin. 3 trees, and each tree is giving off a pound of fig cake. Whatever we learned till now, you can plow the whole field till Shavuos, is true for a field that has 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 trees inside the Beit Sa'ah. How many figs have to be given off? Does each tree need to give off its own pound? We'll see tomorrow. And then the Mishnah continues, Hoyu Asora. What happens if the Beit Sa'ah has 10 trees in it? Lineda will take a look at that halacha tomorrow. I'm just reading this. Everybody can be a little patient. The Mishnah is going to deal with more than 3, between 3 and 9. Again, less than 3, there's no conversation. You don't have a tree field. 3, you have a tree field if each of them can give off the pound of fig cake. you have a tree field from 3 to 9 as well. And at that point, you can plow until Shavuos. And there's special halachas about 3 to 9. Once you have 10 trees in a Beit Sa'ah, you go to a different halacha, and we'll see that tomorrow. So right now, what we have is the halacha of a Beit Sa'ah with 3 trees in it. We're not dealing yet with 4 and 5. That's tomorrow. We have a Beit Sa'ah, 3 trees. Each tree, it could be a fig tree, and each tree can give off a pound of fig cake, or can be a pomegranate tree. And we hypothetically look at it and understand that this is a big enough tree to give off a pound of figs, pound of fig cake, if it was a fig tree. Then we're allowed to plow the field till Shavuos. If the field Beit Sa'ah has 3 trees, but one of them cannot give off the pound of fig cake, we don't have a tree field, we have a grain field. You can only plow the field till Pesach. Between Pesach and Shavuos, that field that is missing the Shiur, one tree is not giving off a pound of fig cake, you can only plow till Pesach. From Pesach and till Shavuos, you can only plow Litzar Khan, the minimum need, which is directly under the 3 trees, and the picker size, an amma, and the basket size, an amma. And these halachas of Tos v'Shviis, Shavuos, Pesach, is Bizman Shabeis Hamikdash Kayed B'Meher Yamein.